As the 18th century dawned on the North American continent, four powers, the French, the Spanish, the British, and the Native Americans, were competing to see who would control this remarkable land. However, after half a century of almost continuous wars, a new force emerged, the Americans. It would be the Americans, not the other four powers, who would control what would become the United States. In the process, the Americans created, by the end of the 18th century, the greatest experiment in self-government the world has ever seen. It was a dark, wintry night, and it is perhaps the best-known image of the Revolutionary War, George Washington crossing the Delaware River. After triumphs at Concord, Ticonderoga, and Bunker Hill, the colonies were now experiencing mostly retreat and defeat. By the end of 1776, reversals were everywhere. The British successfully evacuated Boston. Under General John Burgoyne, they retook Montreal, maintaining their hold on Canada. A British force under the Howe brothers landed in New York and easily drove Washington's ill-trained army from New York City. The result was American forces lost thousands of men and tons of much-needed supplies. The British now controlled the lower Hudson and were poised to move northward from New York and southward from Canada to cut off New England, the center of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies. In this bleak hour, Washington was forlorn and wrote on December 18th,
"I am wearied to death. I think the game is pretty near up."
With the isolation of New England seeming all but finished, two great moments in history came to pass. Thomas Paine wrote the first of his famous letters on the American crisis. These letters appeared in newspapers throughout the colonies.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Thomas Paine.
Meanwhile, George Washington conceived a series of bold strokes to revive the spirits of all Americans. Wintering in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, Washington divided his army in three forces. The three groups would cross the Delaware River and converge on Hessian mercenaries at Bordentown in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington's force was the only one to make the crossing. They caught the German soldiers off guard, and after a 45-minute battle, they captured Trenton. Washington's army returned across the river with 900 prisoners. Washington's second move was to recross the Delaware 4 days later to capture British supplies. To his chagrin, he was met by a force of 6,000 under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis. As night fell, the sly fox Washington escaped behind a screen of burning campfires while the British slept. Washington then seized Princeton and its supplies, forcing Cornwallis to move back to Brunswick, New Jersey. At the end of the day, Washington kept them from taking Philadelphia. More importantly, he had re-energized the American cause when, at the lowest moment in the war, a moment of defeat and possible surrender, he had turned the tide and set the politicians and soldiers back on the road to victory. It's called Old Glory, the Stars and Stripes. It's the official flag of the United States, and it had its beginning with an act of the Continental Congress, June 14, 1777.
Resolved that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, which in a blue field, representing a new constellation.
As legend would have it, the first American flag was purportedly made by the Philadelphia seamstress Betsy Ross. Betsy would often tell her relatives and friends of the fateful day when 3 members of a secret committee from the Continental Congress called upon her. Those representatives, George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross, spoke with her about sewing a flag for the new nation. According to Betsy, General Washington showed her a rough design of the flag that included a 6-pointed star. Betsy quickly produced a 5-pointed star, and so impressed the committee that they entrusted her with making the first flag. That flag had 13 stars and 13 stripes. Later, when Kentucky and Tennessee joined the Union, 2 additional stripes were added along with the 2 new stars. This was the flag that Francis Scott Key saw flying over Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, and it inspired him to write the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Later, as new stars were added, the stripes were once again reduced to 13. Old Glory flies at all federal buildings and lands and is the most powerful emotional symbol of freedom for Americans today. Near Saratoga in upstate New York on September 19, 1777, a British Royal Army under the command of General John Burgoyne marched southward on forested roads along the Hudson River. A grand strategy conceived the winter before directed Burgoyne to move downriver and meet up with General Clinton's army from New York City. Britain hoped that by isolating New England from the rest of America, they would crush American resistance and bring a quick end to the war. However, on that late summer day, an American army under the command of Horatio Gates fought Burgoyne's royal troops to a standstill. For the next 3 weeks, Burgoyne waited vainly for Clinton's reinforcements, while more American soldiers arrived at Gates' encampment. 3 weeks later, the British faced over 17,000 American army and militia, and on October 7th, a second battle began in a clearing outside of Saratoga. By nightfall, the British had suffered over 1,000 casualties. The next morning, Burgoyne's forces retreated northward. On October 17th, with his men exhausted and surrounded, General Burgoyne surrendered. The Americans had just won the most decisive battle of their Revolutionary War. Vanquished was a British army of 5,000 troops, and all their munitions and equipment fell into American hands. This single American victory stunned Britain and heralded her eventual defeat. When news of the American victory reached Europe, France openly became an ally to the American cause. In the winter of 1777 and 78, America's minister to France, Benjamin Franklin, negotiated 2 treaties between France and the United States. In the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, France not only recognized American independence, but the new nation's right to trade with whom it wanted. At the same time, the Treaty of Alliance brought France into the war. The treaty's stated purpose was to assure the liberty, sovereignty, and independence absolute and unlimited of the United States. The change in fortunes was astonishing. A year earlier, America's government was in disarray, its army in retreat, and its cause teetering on the brink of failure. With the victory at Saratoga, the tide of battle in the Revolutionary War turned. American resistance firmed, the morale of her army soared. New England was safe, and France committed her navy and troops to the cause of U.S. independence. Still, the war was far from finished. A powerful British army occupied Philadelphia, and ahead lay two major phases of the Revolutionary War, Valley Forge and the battle for the Mid-Atlantic states and the Southern Campaign. Today, America's naval power stands second to none. The ships and the men and the women of this mighty force can trace their origins back to the Revolutionary War and the influence of its most acclaimed naval hero, John Paul Jones. Jones's determination essentially founded the U.S. Navy, and he sustained its life during the Revolutionary War through the force of his indomitable will against vastly superior British forces. Jones went to sea at the tender age of 13 and came to America 13 years later in 1773, already a seasoned captain. 4 years after his arrival, he was given command of the Ranger. At the same time, Congress authorized the Stars and Stripes as the U.S. flag, and Jones was the first to hoist the flag on an American warship. In November 1777, Jones sailed for France, carrying word of the British surrender at Saratoga. Once there, he received from France the first salute recognizing the Stars and Stripes and the United States as an independent nation. For the next 2 years, Jones and the Ranger pillaged the British coast, at one point capturing the British sloop of war, the Drake. In 1779, Jones proclaimed his most famous words while commanding the Balloon Richard against the British ship Serapis. Severely outgunned, he quickly found himself in desperate straits. Asked to strike his colors, he answered with his immortal phrase, "I have not yet begun to fight." An hour later, the Serapis surrendered. With this one battle, Jones set the standard for American naval valor for centuries to come. The Navy he founded grew slowly in importance. From the Revolutionary War to the Mexican-American War, its small size dictated a strategy of commercial raiding and single-ship engagements which produced stunning victories. During the Civil War, the United States began to develop a larger fleet, and the North, with its numerical superiority, was able to blockade southern ports. Over the next 30 years, Alfred T. Mahan argued for a new American Navy composed of steel-hulled, steam-driven ships. A true fleet that has continued to grow into the 20th century until no other nation on the planet possesses a Navy that can assemble fleets on every ocean. The United States naval superiority can be traced back to the traditions of valor in honor of John Paul Jones during the American Revolutionary War. The winter of 1777 and 78 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, was the dark night of the soul for George Washington and the Continental Army. Encamped at an old ironworks a few miles from British-occupied Philadelphia, Washington and his men suffered through a winter of hell in these makeshift log cabins. Washington wrote from Valley Forge,
To see the men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie upon, without shoes, without a house or hut to cover them until those could be built, and submitting without a murmur, as a proof of patience and obedience which, in my opinion, can scarcely be paralleled.
Earlier in 1777, while Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates defeated and captured a 5,000-man British army at Saratoga, New York, a much larger contingent of British troops commanded by General Howe chased General Washington and his force around Pennsylvania. As winter set in, Howe and his army retired to Philadelphia, where they encamped comfortably until spring. Washington moved his troops to inclement Valley Forge, close enough to keep an eye on the British. It was during this winter that Washington, with the help of the Prussian military expert Frederick von Steuben, welded these tattered forces into a disciplined corps of American soldiers, a formidable army that would settle the question once and for all of whether there was to be an American nation. Valley Forge also added immensely to General Washington's stature and the stature of the American cause. So when the news of the French and American alliance reached the American shores, the British, fearing a blockade of the Delaware Bay by the French fleet, decided to move the troops north to New York. In response, Washington immediately left Valley Forge, and a Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey ensued. It was a battle that saw the American Continental Army fight the seasoned British troops to a standstill. One of the heroes of Monmouth was Mary Ludwig Hayes, a nurse at Valley Forge. On the bullet-swept battlefield of Monmouth in the summer of 1778, Mary earned her nickname, Molly Pitcher, while carrying pitchers of water to wounded men and for cooling down the artillery pieces. During the course of the battle, her husband fell wounded. Molly took his place, and the battery continued to fire. For her heroic role, General Washington gave her a battlefield rank of sergeant. After the Battle of Monmouth, the Revolutionary War was about to enter the end game, a game that would now shift to the South, as Howe's successor, General Clinton, was about to move a part of his army from New York to South Carolina. Valley Forge was the turning point for the American Army and the nation. In the 21st century, the men and women of America's armed forces carry on the traditions first begun at Valley Forge and are the best trained army in the world. Native American chiefs called him the first man living, the great invincible Long Knife. Born in Virginia in 1752, by the age of 20, he was already a skilled frontiersman surveying land in Kentucky.
Good to see you in Kentucky.
5 years later, he sat at this table, developing a strategy that next to independence itself would be the greatest prize of the American Revolution. He was a man whose myths paled in comparison to real-life deeds. He was George Rogers Clark, a true American hero. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Britain controlled the Ohio River Valley and the upper Great Lakes region through forts originally established by the French in the early part of the 18th century. From these forts, they used their Indian allies to attack American settlers in Kentucky, in hopes of opening a Western front against the Americans and tipping the war in favor of Britain. Virginia Governor Patrick Henry entrusted George Rogers Clark, then just 25 years old, with the defense of American settlers along this frontier, the Northwest Territory. Clark was over 6 feet tall and ruggedly built, fiery and daring. His warrior feats inspired fear and respect in his Indian enemies. His personal rapport with his men filled them with an eagerness for battle and inspired them to heroic deeds. Clark's plan was simple and direct. Take and hold the old French forts the British used to supply their Indian allies. In June 1778, Clark and 175 men left for a raid on Kaskaskia in present-day Illinois. On July 4th, they took the fort by surprise without firing a single shot. Clark offered the French inhabitants all the privileges of American citizenship in return for their oath of allegiance. This and the news of the recent Franco-American alliance won their support. Swiftly, other French forts accepted Clark's terms, including nearby Cahokia and Vincennes in Indiana. At the same time, Clark made peace with many of the Indian tribes in the surrounding territory. However, when news of Clark's actions reached British leaders, they sent a force from Detroit under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton to retake Vincennes. Clark immediately realized that with the loss of this strategic fort, the British could once again control the region. In the dead of winter, he wrote Patrick Henry,
"If I fail, this country and also Kentucky is lost.
On February 25th, after a 240-mile march over rough, wintry terrain, Clark and 207 volunteers recaptured Vincennes by fooling the British commander into believing he faced a vastly superior force of 600. From that date, Clark broke the power of the British in the West and made it possible for America to claim all of the Northwest Territory at the end of the war. The new government of the United States never reimbursed or properly thanked Clark for his heroic efforts and sacrifices. However, like the true American hero, he continued to serve his country, advising Jefferson throughout his life. His younger brother, William Clark, led the Lewis and Clark expedition into the newly acquired Louisiana Territory in 1804. George Rogers Clark was the archetypal American hero. At his funeral in 1818, John Rowan said,
The mighty oak of the forest has fallen, and now the scrub oaks may sprout all around. The father of the western country is no more.
By 1778, the war had proved unwinnable for Britain in the north. The number of patriots vastly outnumbered loyalists, and the Continental Army was equal to anything Britain could place on the field. Believing they would find more loyalists among the aristocratic southern plantation owners, British leaders shifted the war south to Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Washington's home state of Virginia. At first, the southern campaign went badly for the Americans. In 1778, the British had captured Savannah. Charleston fell in 1780. Soon after, British forces under General Cornwallis worked their way through North Carolina and into Virginia. But a series of lightning-quick victories for the Americans turned the tide of war. At Kings Mountain in North Carolina, a Tar Heel militia destroyed a British force. At this place, known as Cowpens, Daniel Morgan's troops decimated a British army of 1,000, killing and wounding 900 of them. General Cornwallis called this defeat a very unexpected and severe blow. Then at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis's army was mauled severely by colonial troops. He was forced to retreat toward the Virginia coast, where in an unexpected twist of fate, Britain and the new United States would settle the Revolutionary War not far from the site of Britain's first colony, founded 174 years earlier. The big battle should have taken place in New York, but Washington had fooled General Clinton and took his army south. While General Cornwallis and his men dug in at Yorktown, the French landed 3,000 troops near Williamsburg and waited for Washington's arrival. The siege of Yorktown began in September 1781. The French fleet blockaded the coast, and 17,000 American and French troops surrounded the British position on land. On October 17, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered unconditionally to Washington. The war was over. Celebrations rang out through the colonies, and the British were in shock. On hearing the news of Cornwallis's defeat, Britain's Prime Minister Lord North exclaimed, "Oh my God, it is all over!" America won largely because of the alliance with France, the ineptitude of Britain's leaders, and the Continental Congress's good sense in hiring George Washington to lead its army. But Britain also lost the war because the war was not only a revolution for independence, but also a revolution in war itself. By 1780, Britain had occupied America's four major cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, which in a conventional European conflict would have signaled victory. However, America's cities were not the center of the country's strength, for the center of America was everywhere. Each American man and woman were themselves the nation. The American forces were not fighting for a distant monarch, but for themselves. This unusual sketch shows the American negotiators Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence at the 1783 Treaty of Paris, signing the document that ended the Revolutionary War. Missing from the sketch are the British negotiators, who refused to sit for the painting. This work of art is a perfect symbol of the gulf that separated Britain and its former colonies. After 8 years of war, America had cast off the chains of British rule, but she gained much more than her independence. The nation received all lands west to the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes to Florida. The treaty also allowed the United States unfettered navigation of the Mississippi River and fishing rights off of Newfoundland. 100,000 Loyalists were promised compensation and allowed to move to Canada or Britain. America was now ready to begin the grand experiment in self-government and the unbridled expansion to the west, which would result in the admittance of 2 new states into the Union before the end of the century. The Treaty of Paris gave to the new country everything it needed to launch itself upon the world's stage: commerce and land. With these 2 elements, this new nation would supplant England and France as the world's superpower in a mere 175 years.